Billionaire about to jump off bridge stopped by a homeless girl, but he grabs her arm and the unexpected happens. Comment what you think will happen and subscribe to the channel to support my work. The rain was relentless, hammering down on New York City, turning the streets into raging rivers. From atop the Brooklyn Bridge, Ethan Voronin stared down at the churning waters below, his body leaning precariously over the railing. His fingers trembled as he lit his last cigarette, the one he'd promised himself would be the final one. The wind howled around him, but he barely felt the cold. His mind was trapped in other memories, other rainy nights. His red and swollen eyes stared into the void. There were no more tears to shed. Exactly 365 days ago, on this very bridge, he had destroyed everything he loved. The smell of bourbon on his breath, the blurry vision, the screech of tires, and then silence. A silence that haunted him to this day. Ava and Lily. The names that now only existed etched on a cold tombstone. His wife and his little princess of 5 years. In a single moment of stupidity, he had lost them forever. The accident that changed everything happened so fast, he didn't even have time to scream. When he woke up 6 months later in a hospital bed, it was already too late. Ethan flicked the cigarette butt into the dark water below. His fingers caressed the crumpled paper in his pocket, the last letter he had written, begging for forgiveness for his cowardice. What was the point? Of the entire empire he had built, the millions in his bank account, the luxury penthouse in Tribeca, none of it could bring back the smiles he had silenced. People driving by slowed down to look. Some honked, others shouted words that were lost in the wind. Ethan didn't care. In his mind, he could only see Lily's face with her golden curls and blue eyes like her mother's. The same blue that stared back at him every morning in the mirror, reminding him of his guilt. He climbed onto the railing with a fluid movement, feeling the cold metal structure beneath his feet. It was an appropriate night to leave. Dark, stormy, lonely, just like his soul had become. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath of the city's humid air. In a few seconds, it would all be over. The pain, the guilt, the memories, all the weight he carried would finally be released. That's when he heard it. A small voice, almost lost among the sounds of the storm. "Mister, why do you want to jump?" Ethan opened his eyes, turning slowly. There, less than 6 feet away from him, stood a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old, the same age Lily was when... He blinked several times, trying to focus his vision. Was he already hallucinating? The girl took a step forward. Her dark hair was soaked, plastered to her dirty face. Her clothes, old and torn, clung to her thin body. But it was her eyes that captivated Ethan. Big, dark, overflowing with an innocence he thought he would never see again. "If you jump, will it hurt a lot? Will you get a boo-boo?" Her words were simple, direct, but they hit Ethan like a punch to the stomach. His throat tightened, his legs began to tremble. The rain continued to fall, but now other people were starting to notice the scene. Cars stopped, cell phones were raised. Voices shouted in panic. A crowd began to form, but Ethan could only see that small figure in front of him. The girl took another step, extending her small, dirty hand towards him. Her eyes showed no fear, only a genuine curiosity that pierced Ethan's soul. "If you go, can I go with you?" Time seemed to freeze. Ethan's heart, which for months had only been beating out of obligation, suddenly raced in his chest. Police sirens began to wail in the distance. People were shouting, some running towards them, but none of that mattered. Without thinking, he reached out and took the girl's hand. It was small and cold, like Lily's. For an endless moment, no one breathed. The whole world seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. And then, in a quick and decisive movement, Ethan pushed the girl back, making sure she was safe on the bridge. People screamed, some ran to reach them, but it was too late. Ethan Voronin closed his eyes and let his body fall forward, towards The churning waters of the East River. The wind whistled in his ears as he fell. In his last moments of consciousness, all he could think about were those eyes, the eyes of the girl who, for a brief moment, made him remember that there was still goodness in the world. The last thing he felt was the violent impact against the water. Then only darkness. The constant beeping of the machines was the first sound Ethan heard when he returned to consciousness. The pain was excruciating. Each breath felt like tearing his lungs apart. Each movement sent waves of agony through his body. He tried to open his eyes, but the fluorescent light blinded him momentarily. The smell of antiseptic and medication filled his nostrils, bringing back memories he had tried to bury. 6 months. That's how long he was in a coma last time after the accident that took Ava and Lily from him. Now, once again, he was trapped in a hospital bed. Death had rejected him again, as if his suffering wasn't enough. "Mr. Voronin," a female voice called softly. "Can you hear me?" He tried to answer, but his throat was too dry. A nurse appeared in his field of vision, adjusting the IV in his arm. "You were very lucky," she continued. "The doctors said it was a miracle you survived the fall. Multiple fractures, head trauma, hypothermia, but you'll recover." Lucky. Miracle. Ethan wanted to laugh, but the movement only made his chest hurt more. What kind of cruelty was this that kept him alive, forcing him to continue breathing when all he wanted was peace? The hours dragged on. Doctors came and went from the room, asking questions he refused to answer. Social workers tried to talk, but he kept his eyes fixed on the window, watching the grey New York sky. But there was something different this time. A memory that wouldn't leave him alone. The face of that little girl on the bridge. Her big, innocent eyes, her childish voice asking questions no child should ask. Was she real? Or had his tormented mind created that apparition as a last attempt to cling to life? During the night, when the pain kept him awake, Ethan replayed every detail of that moment. Her wet hair, her torn clothes, the small, cold hand that held his. It was too real to be just a hallucination. A week passed. His injuries began to heal, but his restlessness only increased. He needed to know about the girl. He had to find her. "Please," he asked the nurse one morning, his voice still hoarse. "I need to see the news about what happened." The nurse hesitated, but eventually brought a tablet. Ethan spent hours searching for information about the incident on the bridge. There were several videos, all showing the moment of his fall. In some, you could see a small silhouette from behind, standing in the spot where he was moments before. But the girl's face never appeared clearly. The reports talked about him. The successful businessman who attempted suicide a year after losing his family in a car accident. Some mentioned a child who allegedly tried to stop him, but no one knew her name or where she had come from. "She exists," he muttered to himself, clutching the tablet tightly. "I need to find her." As soon as he was discharged, against all medical recommendations, Ethan began his search. Still limping, supported by a cane, he walked the streets near the bridge. He asked on every corner, showed blurry photos from the videos, visited shelters and institutions. Nothing. It was as if the girl was a ghost, appearing only on that fateful night, and then disappearing without a trace. The days turned into weeks. Ethan barely slept, obsessed with the search. His luxury penthouse filled with newspaper clippings, notes, maps of the area. The maids whispered that he was losing his mind, but he didn't care. On a particularly frustrating afternoon, his phone rang. It was Michael, his lawyer, and the only friend who still kept in touch. "Ethan, you need to stop this!" Michael's voice sounded worried. "You're destroying yourself. The company needs you. Your employees are worried." "You don't understand," Ethan replied, his voice trembling. "She saved me, Michael, not just that night. She reminded me of Lily. For a moment I felt like I had a purpose again. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. What if she doesn't want to be found? Michael finally asked. Have you thought that maybe... She needs help, Ethan interrupted him. You didn't see how she was. Alone, dirty, asking to jump with me. What kind of life should a child of that age have to ask a question like that? Another week passed. Winter was approaching, bringing increasingly cold nights. Ethan continued his search, now focusing on the poorest areas of the city. It was on one of those nights that he decided to return to the bridge. The place was different from what he remembered. They had installed higher fences, security cameras, emergency phones, measures to prevent other people from trying what he did. He stopped at the same spot where he had climbed onto the railing, letting the light rain, wet his face. The city lights flickered in the distance, reflecting in the dark waters of the river. It was a mesmerizing sight. That's when he heard it. A small sob, almost imperceptible. He turned slowly, his heart racing in his chest. There, huddled against one of the bridge's pillars, was a tiny figure. Dark, disheveled hair covered her face, but Ethan would recognize that silhouette anywhere. He took a step towards her, trying to contain the trembling in his hands. The girl raised her face, and those same big dark eyes stared at him. You came back, she said softly, her voice just a whisper in the cold night. Ethan felt his legs weaken. After so long searching, she was there. But there was something in her gaze, a mixture of recognition and resignation that made his heart clench. What? What's your name? He asked, his voice failing. Leah, she answered, hugging her knees. You're the mister who jumped. Ethan approached closer, noticing the details that the darkness tried to hide. Her clothes were even more worn than before, her face thinner. There was a dark bruise on her left arm, partially covered by the torn sleeve. You're hurt, he said, crouching down with difficulty beside her. What happened? Leah looked away, shrinking even further. Daddy's sick, she murmured. Sometimes when the pain is too strong, he gets different. Her words fell like stones into Ethan's stomach. Before he could answer, a shout echoed. In the night. Liar! Where are you, you little pest? The harsh shout cut through the night like a blade, making Leah flinch even more. Ethan realized that she was trembling, not only from the cold, but from fear. The sound of staggering footsteps approached, accompanied by a raspy cough and slurred words. You know you can't run away like that. The male voice was closer now. I need my meds, and you didn't bring any money today. Ethan stood up, instinctively, positioning himself between Leah and the direction of the footsteps. A figure emerged from the shadows, a gaunt man, leaning on makeshift crutches, his face contorted with pain and anger. His clothes were as worn as Leah's, and a strong smell of sweat and sickness emanated from him. Who are you? The man asked, his bloodshot eyes focusing on Ethan with difficulty. Messing with my daughter? Dad, he's not, Leah began, but her voice trailed off when the man took a threatening step toward her. Shut up, he shouted, losing his balance for a moment. You had a job, a simple job, begging for money, and you can't even do that, right? Ethan felt his blood boil. The cane in his hand trembled slightly as he controlled the impulse to lunge at the man. Sir, he said with forced calm, your daughter is cold and hungry. Let me help. The man laughed, a bitter and sickly sound. Help, like all the others who promised to help, like the doctors who left me like this? He gestured to his right leg, which Ethan now realized was grotesquely deformed. Nobody helps anyone in this city. Every man, for himself. Leah moved silently, picking something up from the ground, a small plastic cup with a few coins. She held it out to her father with trembling hands. I got this today, Dad. It's not much, but... The man snatched the cup from her hand so hard that Leah stumbled backward. The coins clinked sadly against the plastic. That doesn't even pay. "For half of my meds," he growled. "You're getting lazy, just like your mother was." The mention of her mother made Leah shrug, as if she had been slapped. Ethan noticed silent tears running down her dirty face. "How much?" Ethan asked abruptly. "How much do your meds cost?" The man looked at him suspiciously. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I'm going to pay for them." Ethan was already taking his wallet out of his pocket. "With one condition, you'll let your daughter sleep in a warm place tonight." "Ha! And where would that be?" "At your place, maybe." The man took another step forward, staggering. "Think I don't know who you are, Ethan Voronin? I saw your face in the papers. The rich businessman who tried to kill himself, who killed his own family." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He stumbled slightly, leaning more on his cane. Leah looked at him with wide eyes, a new understanding dawning on her childish face. You're that mister from the accident?" she asked softly. "The one on TV?" Ethan couldn't answer. The guilt, always present, seemed to suffocate him again. But before he could recover, Leah's father began to cough violently. His thin body doubled over and he lost his balance, falling to his knees on the wet ground. "Dad!" Leah ran to him, all caution forgotten. The man continued to cough, now with spots of blood appearing on his hand. His face was even paler, and his breath came in painful gasps. "The meds," he managed to say between fits of coughing. "In the shack, all gone." Ethan didn't hesitate. "Where do you live? Leah, can you show me?" The girl nodded, tears still streaming silently. "It's near here, but Dad can't walk there like this." "I'll help," Ethan said, setting aside his cane and approaching the man. Ignoring the pain in his own body, still recovering from the fall, he put Roberto's arm around his shoulders. "Show me the way." The journey was slow and painful. The man, who Ethan learned was called Roberto, alternated between coughing fits and moments of semi-consciousness. Leah walked ahead, guiding them through narrow, dark alleys until they reached an even poorer area of the city. The shack, as Roberto had called it, was actually a tiny room in the back of an abandoned building. The smell of mold and dampness was suffocating. There was no furniture other than an old mattress on the floor and some cardboard boxes stacked in the corner. Ethan helped Roberto lie down on the mattress while Leah lit a worn candle. Apparently, there was no electricity. In the flickering light, the place seemed even more desolate. "The meds," Roberto murmured, pointing weakly to one of the boxes. Leah ran to get the box, but when she opened it, her small face contorted in despair. "Dad, there aren't any left." Roberto's breathing was getting more difficult with each moment. His face was covered in cold sweat, and his eyes were beginning to lose focus. "What meds are they?" Ethan asked, taking an empty blister pack from Leah's hands. "For tuberculosis," Roberto replied between gasps, "and for the pain." Ethan felt his heart clench. Tuberculosis, a disease that had treatment that could be cured if treated properly. How had this man reached this point? "I'll get your meds," he said, already grabbing his cell phone. "I know people, I can—" "No!" Roberto grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "I don't want your charity. I don't want to owe anything." "Dad, please," Leah pleaded, her small voice full of fear. "Let him help." Roberto coughed again, more blood staining his lips. "You don't understand," he said, looking at Ethan with feverish eyes. "They already tried to help before. The doctors said they were going to fix my leg, but they only made everything worse. Lost my job, lost everything." His words were interrupted by another violent fit of coughing. Leah held his hand, crying openly now. "Mr. Roberto," Ethan said, kneeling beside the mattress. "I promise this time will be different. Let me at least try, for Leah." The man looked at his daughter, and something in his face changed. For a moment, the mask of bitterness fell away, revealing only a desperate and scared father. "My girl," he murmured, caressing Leah's dirty face with trembling fingers. "Forgive me. For everything." His eyes began to close, his breathing becoming more shallow. "Dad!" Leah called, shaking his hand. "Dad, don't sleep, please." Ethan was already dialing 911, his voice urgent as he gave the approximate address. But as they waited for the ambulance, watching Roberto struggle to breathe, a question echoed in his mind. How had this story reached this point? And more importantly, what would happen to Leah if her father didn't survive? The distant sound of sirens began to cut through the night. But for Ethan, it seemed too late. Too late. The lights in the hallway of Columbia University Irving Medical Center flickered intermittently, casting restless shadows on the white walls. Ethan remained seated in one of the uncomfortable chairs in the waiting room, watching Leah, who had finally fallen asleep on the bench next to him, using his jacket as a blanket. Her dirty clothes contrasted with the sterile environment of the hospital, drawing judgmental glances from other patients. The last few hours had been a chaotic blur. The arrival of the ambulance, the paramedics struggling to stabilize Roberto, the frantic race to the hospital. Ethan had used all his influence to ensure he was treated immediately, but even so, the situation was critical. "Mr. Voronin," a young doctor approached, her features tense beneath the surgical mask. "Can we talk in private?" Ethan looked at Leah, hesitant to leave her alone. The doctor understood his concern. "She looks exhausted," she commented softly. "She'll probably sleep for quite a while. We can be quick." With one last look at the sleeping girl, Ethan followed the doctor to a small consulting room. Dr. Bennett, as she introduced herself, closed the door and indicated a chair for him. "Mr. Roberto's situation is more complex than we imagined," she began, her professional tone only partially masking her concern. "The tuberculosis is in an advanced stage, and he apparently abandoned treatment months ago. This, combined with severe malnutrition and the chronic infection in his leg." She paused, consulting some notes on her clipboard. "About the leg," she continued, "we found records of an unsuccessful surgery performed 2 years ago at St. Luke's Hospital. There were complications, tissue necrosis. It was a case that generated a lawsuit for medical malpractice, but apparently Mr. Roberto didn't have the resources to pursue it." Ethan felt his stomach churn. The story was beginning to make sense. A hard-working man who, after a disastrous surgery, lost everything. Unable to work, without money for proper treatment, he saw his life completely crumble. "What's the chance of recovery?" he asked, dreading the answer. Dr. Bennett sighed. "If we can control the infection in the next few days, we can restart the tuberculosis treatment. But the leg, it will probably be necessary to amputate to prevent the infection from spreading further." The words hung heavy in the air. Ethan, he thought of Roberto, his wounded pride, his refusal to accept help. How would he react to this news? "And the girl?" he asked. "She needs to be examined too. She may have been exposed to the disease." "I've already arranged that," the doctor replied. "As soon as she wakes up, we'll run the necessary tests. But Mr. Voronin, there's another matter we need to discuss." She hesitated for a moment, carefully choosing her words. "Child Protective Services has been notified. It's standard procedure in cases like this. They'll come to assess the minor's situation." Ethan's heart raced. "They can't take her," he said firmly. "She's already suffered too much." "I understand your concern, but there are protocols to be followed. A child living in unsanitary conditions, possibly exposed to a serious infectious disease, signs of possible domestic violence." "I'll take responsibility for her," Ethan interrupted, "for as long as it takes." Dr. Bennett looked at him with a mixture of surprise and skepticism. "Mr. Voronin, with all due respect, your own situation is complicated. Your recent troubles are public knowledge. I don't know if it would be appropriate. Appropriate? His voice rose slightly. What's not appropriate is throwing this girl into foster care, separating her from the only family member she has, traumatizing her even more. Before the doctor could respond, they were interrupted by a nurse who burst into the room. "Doctor, the patient is having a cardiac arrest." What followed was another blur of movement and urgency. Ethan watched, helpless, as the medical team rushed to try to save Roberto's life. The minutes dragged on like hours. When he returned to the waiting room, he found Leah awake, sitting rigidly on the bench. Her big eyes were fixed on him, as if they could read his soul. "My dad's going to die, isn't he?" she asked in a small voice that didn't match the hardness of her words. Ethan felt his heart break. How could such a young child speak of death so naturally? What kind of life had she led so far? "The doctors are doing everything they can," he replied, sitting down beside her. "Your dad is strong, Leah. He's going to fight." "He wasn't always like this, you know," she continued, playing with the torn hem of her shirt. "He used to smile. He worked on a big construction site, building skyscrapers. He used to take me for ice cream on Sundays." Silent tears began to stream down her dirty face. "After he hurt his leg, he changed. He started drinking that medicine that makes him sleep. Sometimes he even forgets to eat. He only talks about the meds. Ethan put his arm around her small shoulders, feeling her tremble. "I try to help," she sobbed. "I beg for money. On the street, I look for food in the restaurant's garbage. But it's never enough. He always gets angry, says I'm just like my mom, lazy, useless." "Your mother?" Ethan hesitated. "What happened to her?" Leah wiped away her tears with her dirty sleeve. "I don't know. One day she left and didn't come. Her back. Dad says she ran away with another man, that she abandoned us, but sometimes when he's sleeping, he cries and calls for her." The silence that followed was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps. Dr. Bennett was returning, and her expression made Ethan's blood run cold. "Mr. Voronin," she called softly, "we need to talk." But before they could move, two women approached. One of them carried a folder with the logo of Child Protective Services. "Good evening," the older one introduced herself. "I'm Miss Davis, a CPS caseworker. We're here to assess the situation of the minor, Leah Santos." Leah clung to Ethan's arm tightly, her small body trembling even more. "Don't let them take me," she whispered desperately. "Please, Uncle Ethan, please." In that moment, looking at that frightened child who had already suffered so much, Ethan made a decision that would change his life forever. He stood up, placing himself between Leah and the caseworkers. "Ladies," he said with a firmness he didn't feel, "before any decision is made, we need to hear what the doctor has to say about her father's condition." But something in Dr. Bennett's gaze already said it all. And Ethan knew that the real battle was just beginning. The news of Roberto's death fell like a bomb in the silent hospital hallway. Leah didn't cry. Her eyes remained dry, fixed on a distant point on the wall, as if her mind refused to process the information. Her small body was rigid, her fingers clutching tightly to the fabric of Ethan's jacket that still covered her. "We need to take the minor to a temporary shelter," Miss Davis, the caseworker, declared in a voice that tried to sound compassionate but sounded mechanical. "It's standard procedure in these cases." "No," Ethan replied firmly, his voice hoarse from exhaustion and emotion. "She's staying with me." The second caseworker, a younger woman who introduced herself as Sarah, cleared her throat uncomfortably. "Mr. Voronin, we understand your concern, but you have no legal ties to the child. Besides, your recent history—" "My history," Ethan interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "You'd rather throw her into an overcrowded shelter, traumatize her even more?" Dr. Bennett, who had remained silent until then, stepped forward. "If You'll allow me. Perhaps we can reach a temporary agreement. The girl needs to undergo a series of tests, considering her exposure to tuberculosis. This could take a few days. Ms. Davis frowned. Even so, we need to follow protocols. A temporary guardianship requires documentation, psychological evaluation, a home visit. Then let's start now, Ethan declared. He took his cell phone out of his pocket and dialed a number. Michael, I need you at Columbia University Irving Medical Center now. Bring all the necessary documents for a temporary guardianship request. As he spoke, he felt a slight tug on his sleeve. He looked down and met Leah's eyes, now filled with tears she refused to shed. I don't want to go with them, she whispered, her voice trembling. I want to stay with you. Ethan's heart clenched. How do you explain the complex intricacies of bureaucracy to a 5-year-old? How do you make her understand that even wanting to protect her, there was an entire system working against them? The next few hours were a whirlwind of paperwork and discussions. Michael arrived in record time, bringing with him a folder full of documents and his legal expertise. While he argued with the caseworkers, Dr. Bennett began the tests on Leah. The girl remained quiet throughout the process, answering only with nods to the doctor's questions. Her eyes, however, never left Ethan, as if she feared he might disappear if she blinked. Mr. Voronin, Dr. Bennett called him after the initial tests. Can we talk in private? He hesitated, looking at Leah, who was now lying on a gurney, connected to a heart monitor for other tests. I'll be okay here, the girl said softly, trying to smile. I promise I won't run away. In the hallway, the doctor showed him some x-rays and preliminary results. The good news is that there are no signs of active tuberculosis, but we found other concerning issues. She pointed to some spots on the x-rays. Signs of old, poorly healed fractures, ribs, right arm, left ankle. Some seem to be years old, others more recent. Ethan felt his stomach churn. The father, he began but couldn't finish. We can't be sure, Dr. Bennett replied gently. They could be the result of accidents, considering the conditions in which they lived. But along with chronic malnutrition and other indicators of neglect, I'm going to take care of her, Ethan interrupted, his voice full of determination. I'm going to give her everything she needs, a safe home, proper food, education. Mr. Voronin, the doctor hesitated, carefully choosing her words. You're going through a difficult time. The loss of your family, the attempted... Well, you understand my concern. Are you sure you're prepared for this responsibility? The question hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. Was he really prepared? Just a few weeks ago, he was ready to give up everything to jump off that bridge, and now he wanted to become responsible for a traumatized child. Before he could answer, a piercing scream cut through the air. They both rushed back to the examination room, where they found Leah struggling on the gurney, while a nurse tried to hold her down. "No, let me go! I want Uncle Ethan!" she screamed, tears finally streaming down her face. "Don't let them take me!" Ethan ran to her, holding her small hands in his. "I'm here, Leah. I'm not going to let anyone take you." The girl clung to him, sobbing against his chest. They said I'll have to go to a place with other kids, that you can't stay with me." He shot a furious look at the caseworkers who were standing in the doorway. "Did you tell her that? Without me present? We need to prepare her for reality." Ms. Davis replied, although she seemed a little disconcerted. "You have no legal ties." "Yet," Michael interrupted, entering the room with more papers. "I just received a preliminary response from the on-call judge. Considering the exceptional circumstances and Mr. Voronin's resources, he is willing to grant a temporary guardianship of 30 days, during which a more detailed evaluation will be conducted." The relief Ethan felt was momentary. 30 days. It was little time to prove that he could be a suitable guardian, to convince the system that he was the best option for Leah. But there are conditions, Michael continued. Weekly visits from Child Protective Services, psychological counseling for both of you, home assessment. Whatever it takes, Ethan replied firmly, still holding Leah, who was now trembling less, but refused to let go of his shirt. The following hours were a race against time. While Leah finally slept, sedated to complete the necessary tests, Ethan signed documents, made phone calls, organized everything he would need to take her home. "Are you sure about this?" Michael asked softly when they finally had a moment. "Alone, Ethan, you're barely recovering from your own trauma, taking responsibility for a child at this time." "She saved me, Michael," Ethan replied, looking out the hospital window at the city that was beginning to wake up. "That night on the bridge, she reminded me that there is still goodness in the world, that there is still hope." "What if you can't do it? What if it's too much for you?" The question hung in the air like a dark cloud. Ethan closed his eyes, remembering Lily, her innocent smile so similar to Leah's. "Then I'll try harder, and harder, and harder," he replied finally. "Because this time, it's not about me. It's about giving her the chance she deserves." But as he watched the sun rising over New York, a new concern began to grow in his chest. His luxurious apartment, once a symbol of his success, now seemed cold and inadequate. How to turn it into a home for a child who has spent years living on the streets? How to help her overcome her traumas when he himself still struggled with his own? And more importantly, how to protect her from the world that had already been so cruel to her when he himself couldn't protect himself from his own demons? The soft sound of Leah's breathing was his only answer, a constant reminder that from that moment on, every decision he made would affect not only his life, but also hers. It was an overwhelming responsibility, but it was also his chance for redemption. A nurse silently entered the room, carrying some more forms. "Mr. Voronin, we need to discuss the procedures for her father's body." And there was another painful reality that he would need to face. How to explain death to a child who had already lost so much? How to help her say goodbye to a father who, despite all his mistakes, was her only family? Ethan looked at the sleeping Leah, so small and fragile in the hospital bed, and knew that the real fight was just beginning. Ethan's apartment had never seemed so silent. Leah's small, hesitant steps barely made a sound on the marble floor as she observed the surroundings with wide eyes, still wearing the new clothes he had bought in a hurry, a simple light blue dress and white sandals that looked uncomfortable on her feet, accustomed to walking barefoot. After 3 days in the hospital, between tests and bureaucratic procedures, they had finally received authorization to go home. Roberto's funeral had been held the day before, a simple ceremony that Leah attended in absolute silence, refusing to cry even when they threw dirt over her father's simple coffin. "This is your room," Ethan said softly, opening the door to one of the rooms that had been hastily adapted to receive her. "We can decorate it however you want." Leah entered cautiously, as if fearing that everything would disappear if she moved too quickly. The room, formerly an office, now had a small bed with a pink comforter, a white dresser, and some new stuffed animals arranged on the headboard. A hasty attempt to create a welcoming environment for a child. Is it all mine?" she asked, in a whisper, lightly touching one of the stuffed bears as if it were made of crystal. "All yours," Ethan confirmed, feeling a lump in his throat. "But we can change anything you don't like." Leah shook her head negatively, still absorbing every detail of the room. Her eyes stopped at a half-open door that led to a private bathroom. Can I take a bath?" she asked timidly. "Of course," Ethan replied, trying to keep his voice steady despite the pain he felt at seeing how much she hesitated to ask for something so basic. "I'll ask Rose to help you." Rose, the housekeeper, who had worked for him for years, was waiting in the hallway. She was a middle-aged woman with a kind face and hands calloused from work, whom Ethan had specifically chosen to help with Leah because of her maternal nature. "Come, dear," Rose called softly. "Let's prepare a nice warm bath for you." As the two disappeared into the bathroom, Ethan retreated to his own suite, closing the door behind him. Only then did he allow his legs to tremble, leaning against the nearest wall as he tried to control his breathing. The room he had prepared for Leah was right next to what had been Lily's. A room that had remained untouched since the accident, still holding the toys, the clothes, the colorful drawings pinned to the wall. He didn't have the courage to go in there, but he also couldn't bring himself to get rid of anything. The sound of the water running in the bathroom next door brought Ethan back to the present. He needed to be strong. Leah needed him now. About half an hour later, Rose knocked on his door. Her expression was strained. "Mr. Voronin," she said in a low voice, "I think you need to see something." In Leah's room, the girl was sitting on the bed, now wearing new pajamas with a unicorn print. Her wet hair had been carefully combed, revealing her face fully for the first time, and with it, scars that had previously been hidden by dirt and tangled strands. "They're old," Rose explained, her voice trembling slightly. "But there are other more recent marks on her back and legs, and she's so thin, you can count every rib." Ethan felt his stomach churn. The marks confirmed what the hospital tests had already suggested: years of neglect and possible abuse. How could someone hurt a child like that? "Uncle Ethan?" Leah's small voice pulled him from his dark thoughts. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," he replied, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Why is there a locked room there?" She pointed to the door of Lily's room. "Does someone live there?" The air seemed to disappear from Ethan's lungs. Rose, realizing his distress, quickly intervened. "Let's go downstairs to eat something. I made a nice soup." But Leah continued to look at Ethan, her big eyes full of an understanding beyond her age. "It was your daughter's room, wasn't it?" she asked softly. "The one who went to heaven with your wife." Ethan felt tears burn his eyes. How did she know? Had she heard something at the hospital? "Yes," he managed to answer, his voice hoarse. "Her name was Lily." "Was she my age?" "She was." Leah was silent for a moment, as if processing the information. Then, to everyone's surprise, she got up and hugged Ethan. "Don't be sad," she said against his chest. "Now you have me." The words, so innocent and yet so profound, broke something inside Ethan. Before he could control himself, he was crying. For the first time since the accident, he allowed the tears to fall freely. Rose discreetly left the room, leaving the two alone in that moment of shared vulnerability. For several minutes, they remained like that, Ethan crying silently while Leah hugged him, as if her small arms could protect him from all the pain in the world. When he finally calmed down, Ethan realized that Leah was also crying, the first tears she had shed since her father's death. "Sorry," she sobbed. "I didn't want to make you cry." "No, honey," he replied, gently wiping away her tears. "Sometimes we need to cry. It's okay to show that we're sad." The rest of the night passed, as in a hazy dream. They went downstairs to eat the soup that Rose had prepared, but Leah barely touched the food, still unaccustomed to regular meals. Later, while she took the medications prescribed by the hospital, Ethan received a call from Michael. "The first visit from Child Protective Services is scheduled for tomorrow," his friend informed him, "and the psychologist appointed by the judge can see you on Thursday." "So soon?" Ethan asked, watching Leah, who was now huddled on the sofa, hugging one of the new teddy bears. "It's better that way," Michael replied. The sooner we start complying with the judge's requirements, the greater the chances of getting permanent custody. Permanent custody. The words hung heavily in the air. Was that really what he wanted? Was he ready for that responsibility? Later, when he went to put Leah to sleep, he found her sitting on the bed, staring blankly out the window. "I can't sleep," she said before he asked. "It's too quiet here." Ethan understood immediately. After years of sleeping on the street or in a precarious shack, the silence of the luxurious apartment must seem unnatural. "Want me to turn on some music?" he offered. She shook her head negatively. Can you stay here with me? Just for a little bit?" Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, and Leah immediately snuggled up next to him. Within minutes, her breathing became deeper and more regular. She was asleep. Careful not to wake her, he tried to get up, but she grabbed his shirt tightly, even in her sleep, as if she feared he might disappear during the night. "I'm not going anywhere," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "I promise." He stayed there, watching her sleep, noticing how she occasionally writhed and mumbled incomprehensible words. Nightmares, probably. How many traumas did that child carry? How could he help her overcome them? The early hours of the morning passed, and Ethan remained awake, lost in thought. Tomorrow, the real ordeal would begin, convincing the world, and perhaps himself, that he could be a father to Leah, that he could protect her, love her, give her the life she deserved. But as he watched her sleeping face, so similar to Lily's in her most peaceful moments, a new worry began to grow in his chest. What if he failed again? What if he wasn't able to keep his promise? What if he hurt her, as he had hurt his own family? The distant sound of a siren cut through the night, making Leah stir restlessly in her sleep. Ethan hugged her protectively, feeling her small heart beat against his chest. "Everything's going to be all right," he murmured, wishing he could believe. His own words, "everything's going to be all right." But fear, his old companion, remained there, whispering doubts in his ear. And the night seemed endless. The morning arrived grey and cold, bringing with it a sense of apprehension that hung over the apartment like a heavy cloud. Ethan hadn't slept. He had spent the entire night sitting next to Leah, watching her restless sleep, occasionally interrupted by nightmares that made her cry and call for her father. Rose arrived early, bringing with her shopping bags full of fruit, bread, and other things she imagined a child would like. She found Ethan in the kitchen, already on his third cup of coffee, his deep, dark circles betraying the sleepless night. "You need to rest," she said in a maternal tone, beginning to organize breakfast. "How are you going to take care of the girl if you don't take care of yourself?" Before he could respond, a piercing scream cut through the air. Ethan ran to Leah's room, his heart racing. He found her sitting on the bed, eyes wide with terror, breathing with difficulty. "Where's my dad?" she asked as soon as she saw him, her voice trembling. "Where am I?" For a moment she didn't seem to recognize where she was, or who Ethan was. The panic in her eyes was pure and primitive, the fear of a child who woke up in a strange place, far from everything she knew. "It's okay, Leah." He approached slowly, speaking softly. "You're safe. Remember? You're at my house now." Reality seemed to return to her little by little. Her small body relaxed slightly, but her eyes still carried that frightened look of a wounded animal. "Sorry," she murmured, hugging her knees. "I dreamed that my dad was calling me, but when I went to him, he disappeared." Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, maintaining a safe distance so as not to frighten her even more. "Want to talk about it?" She shook her head negatively, wiping her eyes with the back of her hands. "What time are the council women coming?" The question took Ethan by surprise. He didn't know she was aware of the scheduled visit. After lunch, he replied honestly. But you don't need to worry about that now. How about we have breakfast? Rose made pancakes. The mention of food did not provoke the expected reaction. Leah remained huddled, her fingers playing nervously with the hem of her pajamas. What if they don't like me? She asked in a low voice. What if they think I'm too dirty to stay here? Leah, look at me, Ethan asked gently. When she finally looked up, he continued, You're not dirty. You never were, and no one is going to take you away from here, I promise. That's what my mum said, she replied with a wisdom too sad for her age, that she'd be back, that she promised, but I never saw her again. The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. Before he could respond, Rose appeared in the doorway. Breakfast is on the table, dear, she said with her maternal manner. Come, I'll help you get ready first. While Rose helped Leah with her morning routine, Ethan returned to his room. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror, the unshaven beard, the red eyes, the wrinkled clothes. Not exactly the image of a responsible guardian he wanted to project to Child Protective Services. He took a quick shower and got dressed, opting for more casual clothes instead of his usual suits. When he returned to the kitchen, he found Leah sitting at the table wearing a new lavender dress, her hair carefully combed by Rose. She was looking at the plate of pancakes as if it was something alien. You can eat, Rose encouraged. I put plenty of chocolate syrup the way kids like it. Leah picked up the fork awkwardly, clearly not used to using silverware. She cut a tiny piece of the pancake and cautiously brought it to her mouth, as if expecting it to be unpleasant. Her eyes widened with the taste. It's good, she said, surprised, and for the first time since she arrived, a small smile appeared. On her face, the moment of peace was interrupted by the doorbell. Ethan checked the clock. It was still 9 a.m., too early for Child Protective Services. Through the intercom camera, he saw Michael. Sorry to come so early, his friend said as soon as he entered, but we need to review a few things before the visit. Leah immediately tensed, dropping her fork. Her eyes darted nervously from Ethan to Michael, as if expecting bad news. You can continue your breakfast, dear, Rose intervened gently. I'll put on a cartoon for you to watch later. How about that? While Rose distracted Leah, Ethan and Michael went to the office. As soon as the door closed, Michael pulled a folder from his briefcase. I got some information about her past, he said in a low voice. It's not good, Ethan. The documents revealed a history of neglect that went beyond what they imagined. Non-existent school records, no vaccinations in recent years, visits to emergency rooms with unexplained injuries. And more disturbing, a report from 2 years ago when a neighbor called the police after hearing screams coming from the shack where they lived. The police went there, but Roberto denied everything, Michael continued. Said the girl had fallen. No one investigated further. Ethan felt his stomach churn. How did they let this happen? How did no one do anything? You know how it is, Michael replied bitterly. Just another poor family, just another child at risk. The system is overwhelmed. People stop caring. A scream from the living room interrupted the conversation. They ran out of the office and found a chaotic scene. Leah was on the floor, struggling while Rose tried to calm her. No, I don't want to. Don't touch me, she screamed, her small body trembling violently. I just tried to. And clean some syrup that had fallen on her dress, Rose explained, distressed. She just panicked. Ethan approached slowly, kneeling at a safe distance. Leah, it's okay, no one is going to hurt you. But she remained in her own world of terror, her eyes glazed over on something only she could see. Stop, Dad, please. Stop, I'll be good, I promise. Ethan's heart broke. It was a flashback. She was reliving some traumatic moment from the past. Leah, look at me, he called firmly. You're safe. Your dad isn't here. No one is going to hurt you. Gradually, his voice seemed to reach her. The tremor diminished, and her eyes began to focus on the present. When she finally seemed to recognize him, she began to cry. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I dirtied the new dress. I promise I won't do it again." "It's okay, honey," Rose said softly. "We can wash it. It'll be good as new." But Leah continued to cry, now alternating between apologies and promises to be good. It was as if she expected punishment at any moment. Michael watched the scene with concern. "Ethan," he called softly, "Child Protective Services needs to know about these episodes. If we hide something and they find out later—" "I know," Ethan replied, without taking his eyes off Leah, who was gradually calming down in Rose's arms. "But how do I explain this, without making it seem like I'm not prepared to handle the situation?" The answer came in the form of another crisis. When Rose tried to take her to change clothes, Leah panicked again. "No! Don't take off my clothes! Please!" she screamed, struggling again. Ethan felt bile rise in his throat. What kind of trauma made a child so afraid of changing clothes? What had Roberto done to her in the moments when the drink and the pain turned him into a monster? "Maybe we should call a doctor," Michael suggested. "She needs professional help." But before they could decide anything, the doorbell rang again. Through the intercom camera, Ethan saw Ms. Davis and Sarah, the CPS caseworkers, arriving 3 hours before the scheduled time. "Surprise visit," Michael murmured. "They do that to catch people off guard." Ethan looked around. The kitchen still messy from breakfast, Leah still crying in Rose's arms, himself looking like he hadn't slept in days. Not exactly the scenario he had planned for the visit. "What do we do?" he asked Michael, feeling the panic grow. "Let them in," his friend replied. "If we try to postpone it, it'll look like we have something to hide." The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. Leah shrank at the sound, her eyes reverting to that animal fear. "Everything's going to be all right," Ethan said, wishing he could believe his own words. "Everything's going to be all right." But as he walked to open the door, he felt as if he were about to face a firing squad. And worst of all, he knew that it wasn't just his life that was at stake now. The air in the apartment became even heavier. When Ms. Davis and Sarah entered, their evaluating glances scanning every detail of the environment. Leah, still trembling in Rose's arms, hid her face when she saw them. "We arrived earlier to get a more realistic view of the routine," Ms. Davis explained bluntly, pulling a tablet from her folder. "I see we caught you at a delicate moment." Ethan exchanged a quick glance with Michael, who gave a small, encouraging nod. "Leah had an anxiety episode," he explained with all the honesty he could muster. "We're learning to deal with her triggers." Sarah approached Rose and Leah, her tone artificially sweet. "Hi, honey. Remember me? Can we talk for a little bit?" Leah squeezed her arms even tighter around Rose's neck, refusing to look at the caseworker. "Maybe it's better to give her time to calm down," Rose suggested, her maternal voice carrying a note of protection. "She's still scared." "Actually," Ms. Davis intervened, "we need to assess how she reacts in stressful situations. Mr. Voronin, can you ask your employee to put the minor on the floor?" The use of the word minor instead of Leah's name made something churn in Ethan's stomach. She wasn't a case, a number. She was a scared child who needed understanding. "Leah," he called softly, "can you show the ladies your new room? I'm sure they'd like to see how you arranged your teddy bears." To his surprise, Leah slowly raised her head from Rose's shoulder. Her eyes were red and swollen, but there was something different in them now, a determination that he had seen before, that night on the bridge. "Okay," she murmured, allowing Rose to put her on the floor. "But are you going with me?" "Of course," he replied, extending his hand to her, which she held tightly. The group followed to the room, where the caseworkers began to make notes about everything, from the quality of the furniture to the arrangement of the toys. Sarah opened the closet, examining the new clothes still with tags. "Very nice," she commented. But I see she hasn't used most of the pieces yet. We're going slowly, Ethan explained. We don't want to force her to do anything. Miss Davis wrote something on her tablet, her expression unreadable. And about school, have you arranged enrollment yet? Not yet, Michael replied for him. Considering the recent trauma and the need for adaptation, education can't wait, Miss Davis cut in. A 5-year-old needs to be in school. It's the law. Leah, who had been quiet until then, surprised everyone. I can read, she said softly. My dad taught me when he still worked. Before. Her voice failed, and she squeezed Ethan's hand tighter. Is that true? Sarah asked, clearly skeptical. In response, Leah pointed to one of the children's books on the shelf that Rose had bought. Want me to read? Ethan felt his heart clench. It was the first time she had shown any interest in the books since she arrived. We'd love that, he replied, before the caseworkers could say anything. Rose took the book and handed it to Leah, who opened it with reverential care. To everyone's amazement, she began to read slowly, with a few pauses but correctly. Once upon a time, there was a girl who lived with her father in a house in the forest. Her small voice gained more confidence as she read, until she came to a page with the illustration of a happy family. She stopped abruptly, closing the book tightly. I don't want to read anymore, she said, returning the book to Rose. Why not, honey? Sarah asked, her professional tone barely masking her curiosity. Because it's a lie, Leah replied with a cutting honesty. There's no such thing as a happy ending. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of the intercom. Rose went to answer and returned with a worried expression. Mr. Voronin, it's the police, she said hesitantly. They say they found some of Mr. Roberto's belongings and need someone to identify them. Ethan felt Leah freeze beside him. Now's not a good time, he replied, but Miss Davis was already making more notes on her tablet. On the contrary, she said, it's an opportunity to assess how you handle unforeseen situations in relation to the minor. She has a name, Ethan replied, his voice firmer than he felt, and I'm not going to expose her to more trauma. I want to go, Leah surprised everyone again. I need to see. Honey, you don't have to, Rose began, but Leah interrupted her. Please, Uncle Ethan, what if there's something important? What if there's a picture of my mom? The mention of her mother silenced everyone. It was the first time Leah had shown interest in anything related to her. All right, Ethan conceded, but first let's get ready, okay? While Rose helped Leah get changed, the caseworkers continued their inspection of the apartment. They stopped in front of the locked door of Lily's room. Is this room off limits? Miss Davis asked, already making more notes. It's a private room, Michael replied diplomatically. It's not part of the area designated for Leah. We need to see all the rooms, Sarah insisted. It's protocol. Before Ethan could protest, Leah returned to the living room, now dressed, in a simple set of pants and a shirt. Her eyes immediately focused on the locked door. It's her room, isn't it? She asked softly. Lily's. Ethan felt his heart stop. How did she know the name? I heard you talking during the night, she explained, as if reading his thoughts. When I was having a nightmare. The caseworkers exchanged meaningful glances, making more notes. Ethan knew what they were thinking, that he wasn't emotionally stable enough to care for a child, that his own traumas could affect Leah. Shall we go downstairs? He suggested, trying to change the focus of the conversation. The police are waiting. In the lobby of the building, 2 detectives were waiting with a battered cardboard box. Leah hid partially behind Ethan upon seeing them, but her eyes were fixed on the box. We found it in the shack, one of them explained. We thought the family would like to have it. Ethan knelt down to Leah's level. Do you want me to look first? She shook her head negatively, taking a step forward with a courage that made his heart clench. The caseworkers observed every movement, their pens ready to record any reaction. Inside the box were some old documents, a broken watch, some worn clothes, and, at the bottom, an old work permit. Leah picked up the permit carefully, opening it with trembling fingers. It was from the time he built skyscrapers, she said, her voice choked when he still smiled. She continued to rummage in the box until she found something that made her eyes widen, an old and crumpled photo. In it, a young woman was holding a baby, smiling at the camera. "Mom," she whispered, caressing the photo with reverence. "She looks a lot like you," Ethan commented softly. "No," Leah replied with an ancient sadness in her voice. "She was pretty. Dad always said I look more like him. That's why she left. Because she didn't think I was pretty enough to stay." The words hit everyone like a punch. Rose discreetly wiped away a tear. The caseworkers, for the first time, seemed to have lost their professional pose. "That's not true, honey," Sarah said, her voice genuinely gentle for the first time. "I'm sure that—" "Yes, it is," Leah interrupted her. "Dad said so. When he drank that medicine that made him angry, he always said that she left because of me, that I was just trouble, that no one would ever want me." Ethan felt something break inside him. He knelt in front of Leah, ignoring the glances of the caseworkers. "Look at me," he asked softly. When she raised her eyes, he continued, "None of that is true. You are beautiful, intelligent, and stronger than anyone I have ever met. If your mother left, it was her problem, not yours. Never yours." "Then why doesn't anyone stay?" she asked, silent tears streaming down her face. "Why does everyone leave?" "I won't," Ethan replied with a certainty he didn't know he had. "No matter what happens, I'm not going anywhere." "Promise?" she asked, her small voice carrying the weight of all the broken promises she had ever received. "I promise," he replied, and for the first time since the accident, he felt he was doing the right thing. Ms. Davis cleared her throat, breaking the moment. "We need to continue our assessment," she said, but her tone was different, less clinical, more humane. As they went back up to the apartment, Ethan noticed that Leah was still holding the photo tightly. But there was something different about her posture, as if a weight had been lifted from her small shoulders. The day would still be long, he knew. There were more questions to answer, more evaluations to pass. But looking at Leah, who now held his hand with renewed confidence, Ethan felt that maybe, just maybe, they could get through this together. The photo of Leah's mother, however, held more secrets than anyone could imagine. Secrets that would soon come to light, testing not only Ethan's promise, but also the fragile bonds that were beginning to form between them. Night fell over New York City, bringing with it a fine and persistent rain. The CPS caseworkers had finally left after hours of exhausting questioning, leaving behind an atmosphere charged with tension and uncertainty. Ethan was sitting in his office, staring blankly at the photo that Leah had found earlier. Something about that image bothered him, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly what. The woman in the photo, Leah's mother, had a gentle smile and expressive eyes, very similar to her daughter's. Her dark hair framed a young and pretty face, and she held the baby with obvious affection. She didn't seem like someone capable of abandoning a child. "Mr. Voronin," Rose's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Leah is asking for you. I think she had another nightmare." He put the photo in the drawer and went to the girl's room. He found her sitting on the bed hugging the teddy bear, her little face marked by recent tears. "Want to talk about the dream?" he asked softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. Leah was silent for a moment, her fingers playing nervously with the bear's ear. "I dreamed about the day my mom left," she said finally, her voice almost a whisper. But this time it was different. "Different how?" "She was crying," Leah continued, frowning as if trying to remember something important. "And there was a man yelling at her. It wasn't my dad, it was another man. And he seemed angry, very angry. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Do you remember what this man looked like? Leah shook her head negatively. I just remember he was big. And he wore a shiny ring on his finger. It made noise when he hit the table. Ethan's heart raced. A ring, it could just be a creation of a traumatized child's mind. But something about that specific detail disturbed him. How old were you when your mother left? He asked, trying to keep his voice calm. I don't really know, she replied, hugging the bear tighter. I was little. Dad said she left when I was 3 years old. But sometimes, when he drank too much, he said other things. What things? That she wasn't worth anything. That she had sold us for money, Leah said, and then her eyes filled with tears again. But that can't be true, right? Moms don't do that. Ethan felt his stomach churn. The story was beginning to take an even darker turn than he imagined. No, honey, he replied, although his mind was already racing with disturbing possibilities. Moms don't do that. At that moment, his cell phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a message from Michael. We need to talk. Urgent. I discovered something about her mother. Uncle Ethan? Leah's small voice brought him back to the present. Can I sleep with you today? The question caught him off guard. It was the first time she had asked for something like that directly. Of course, he replied without hesitation. Want me to tell you a story? To his surprise, she shook her head negatively. I want to tell one to you, she said, and then began. Once upon a time, there was a girl who lived with her father in a very small place. They didn't have much money, but her father always saved a few coins to buy sweet bread on Sunday. Leah's voice trembled slightly, but she continued. One day, her father hurt his leg. The doctors did something wrong, and he never managed to work properly again. He started taking a medicine that made him sleep a lot. Sometimes, when he woke up, he didn't remember who the girl was. Ethan felt his heart clench. She was telling her own story, disguised as a children's tale. The girl tried to help, Leah continued, now with tears streaming silently down her face. She begged for money on the street. She looked for food in the trash. But her father always said it wasn't enough, that she was just like her mother, weak, useless. Liar, Ethan tried to interrupt, but she shook her head. Let me finish, she asked. Then one day the girl saw a sad man on the bridge. He wanted to jump just like the people who sometimes jumped near the shack where she lived. The girl didn't want him to jump because she knew that made people cry a lot afterward. Ethan felt his own tears begin to fall. So she asked if she could go with him. Leah continued, her voice getting lower and lower, because she thought that maybe, if she jumped with him, she would finally find her mother. But the man didn't let her. He pushed her back and jumped alone. She paused, wiping her tears with the sleeve of her pajamas. But unlike the others who jumped, he didn't die. And now he wants to be my new dad. But I'm scared. Scared. Of what? Ethan asked softly. Scared that you'll change too, she replied with a devastating honesty. That you'll start drinking that medicine that makes people get different. That one day you won't remember who I am anymore. Ethan pulled her into a hug, feeling her small body tremble against his chest. That's never going to happen, he promised. I'll never forget who you are, Leah. She sniffled against his shirt. How can you be sure? Because you saved me, he replied with all the sincerity he could muster. Not just that night on the bridge. You save me every day, reminding me that there is still goodness in the world. They stayed like that for a long time, until Leah finally fell asleep in his arms. Carefully not to wake her, Ethan laid her down on the bed and covered her with the blanket. His cell phone vibrated again, another message from Michael. More urgent. It's worse than we imagined. Much worse. We need to meet now. Looking at Leah sleeping peacefully, Ethan felt a different kind of fear begin to grow in his chest. What dark secrets did the past still hold, and how could they affect the fragile bond he was beginning to build with that child who, against all odds, had become his reason for living? Rose appeared at the door, her expression worried. "Go," she said softly. "I'll stay with her. If she wakes up, I'll tell her you went to take care of something important." Ethan nodded, grabbing his coat. The rain was still falling outside, harder now, as if the sky itself were crying for the revelations that were to come. As he drove through the wet streets of New York City towards Michael's office, he couldn't stop thinking about the man with the ring that Leah had mentioned. For some reason, that specific detail made his blood run cold. His phone rang. It was an unknown number. When he answered, a female voice, trembling and hesitant, spoke from the other end. "Mr. Voronin, my name is Marina Santos. I'm Leah's mother." The car skidded slightly on the wet pavement as Ethan felt the world spin around him. Leah's mother was alive, and apparently she had a lot to say. Michael's office was silent, except for the sound of the rain hitting the windows. Ethan sat down heavily in one of the chairs, still stunned by the call he had received. Marina Santos, the woman who had abandoned Leah, who for years had been just a ghost in the girl's painful memories, was alive and wanted to talk to him. "You're not going to believe what I found," Michael said, spreading documents on the table. "I started investigating Leah's mother's past and found something disturbing." Ethan looked at the papers. They were old records of a lawsuit filed years ago. "Marina Santos," he read aloud, "versus Rodriguez Enterprises." Rodriguez, Michael emphasized the name, as in Vincent Rodriguez, the same man who owned the construction company where Roberto worked when he had the accident. The name stirred something in Ethan's memory. Vincent Rodriguez was a well-known figure in the New York business world, rich, powerful, and, according to rumors, ruthless with his enemies. "The lawsuit was dismissed before it even started," Michael continued. "Marina accused the company of negligence in Roberto's accident, but suddenly withdrew the complaint and disappeared. She called me," Ethan said abruptly, "less than half an hour ago." Michael almost dropped his cup of coffee. "What? How did she get your number?" "I don't know," Ethan replied, running his hands over his tired face. "But she seemed scared. She said she needed to tell me the truth about what happened." At that moment, his cell phone vibrated again. It was a message from Rose. Leah woke up crying. "She's asking for you." "I need to go back," he said, standing up. "She's having another nightmare." "Wait," Michael held him by the arm. "There's more. Look at this." He opened an old and yellowed folder, revealing a black and white photo of a corporate party. In the picture, Vincent Rodriguez was smiling at the camera, and on his right hand, a flashy ring glittered. Ethan's heart stopped. It was exactly as Leah had described in her dream, the man with the ring that made noise when he hit the table. "This was taken around the time Roberto worked at the construction company," Michael explained. "And look who's in the background of the photo." Ethan squinted at the faded image. There, almost hidden among other employees, was Marina, younger, thinner, but unmistakably the same woman in the photo that Leah kept. "What really happened?" Ethan murmured, more to himself than to Michael. His cell phone rang again. Another, unknown number. With his heart racing, he answered, "Mr. Voronin." Marina's voice was even more trembling than before. "Can we meet, now?" Ethan looked at Michael, who gave an affirmative nod. "Where?" he asked. "At the coffee shop on the corner of your building," she replied. "I'm watching your daughter from the window. She looks so sad." A cold shiver ran down Ethan's spine. "You're following us." "Please," Marina pleaded, her voice breaking. "I need to explain everything. You need to understand why I did what I did." "I'm coming," Ethan replied dryly, hanging up the phone. "I'm going with you." Michael said, already grabbing his coat. The rain had subsided to a drizzle when they arrived at the coffee shop. The place was almost empty at that time of night, except for a woman sitting alone in a dark corner. Even after years, she still looked a lot like the photo Leah had, the same big and expressive eyes, although they now carried a deep sadness. "Marina Santos?" Ethan asked, sitting down in front of her. Michael remained standing, like a silent sentinel. She nodded, her hands trembling as she held an untouched cup of coffee. "Thank you for coming. I know you must hate me." "It's not me you abandoned," Ethan replied coldly. "Why are you here now?" Marina closed her eyes for a moment as if gathering courage. "Because I saw in the newspapers that you are trying to get custody of her. And because Vincent is coming back to the US. The name made Ethan tense. "What does Vincent Rodriguez have to do with this?" "Everything," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "He is Leah's father." The revelation fell like a bomb in the small coffee shop. Michael let out an exclamation of surprise, and Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. "Impossible," he said. "Roberto wasn't her biological father," Marina interrupted, tears beginning to stream down her face. "He knew that. That's why he started drinking long before the accident. But he loved Leah in his own twisted way." "Start from the beginning," Ethan demanded, his voice trembling with contained anger. "The whole truth." Marina took a deep breath, her hands still trembling. "I worked as a secretary at the construction company. Vincent, he started harassing me. He said that if I didn't give in, Roberto would lose his job. I was pregnant when Roberto found out." She paused, wiping her tears with the back of her hands. "Vincent promised he would take care of us, that he would give the child a good life. But when Leah was born, he changed. He said he couldn't risk his marriage, his reputation. He offered money for us to disappear." "And you accepted?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with disgust. "No," she replied vehemently. "Roberto and I refused." That's when the accident happened. Understanding began to dawn on Michael's face. "It wasn't an accident, was it?" Marina shook her head, more tears falling. "The construction site didn't have adequate safety equipment. Vincent knew that. He planned everything." "And then?" Ethan pressed, although part of him didn't want to hear the rest. "After the accident, we tried to sue the company, but Vincent threatened us. He said that if we continued, something worse would happen. Not to Roberto this time, but to Leah." She stopped, sobbing openly now. "He gave me an ultimatum. Either I disappeared and never tried to contact her again, or Leah would suffer an accident. What father could be capable of threatening his own daughter?" "So you ran," Ethan concluded, his voice icy. "You left your daughter with a broken and traumatized man." "I had no choice," Marina protested. "Vincent had people following us. If I tried to take Leah, he would know. At least with Roberto, she would be relatively safe. Vincent didn't care about her, as long as his secret was protected." "And now," Michael interjected, "why come back after so long?" Marina took an envelope from her bag with trembling hands. "Because Vincent is coming back to the US next week, and because I found this in the old archives of the construction company." Inside the envelope were documents that proved the deliberate sabotage of the safety equipment, direct orders from Vincent for witnesses to be bought off, and even the exact amount paid for the lawsuit to be dismissed. "Why didn't you report this before?" Ethan asked, flipping through the papers with growing horror. "Because I only got access to this now," Marina replied. "And because Vincent is dying, terminal cancer. He has nothing left to lose." "What does that mean?" Michael asked, although his tone suggested that he already knew the answer. "It means he doesn't need to keep up appearances anymore," Marina said, her face pale with fear. "Last week he looked me up. He said he wants to meet Leah before he dies, that it's his right as a father." Never, Ethan growled, standing up abruptly. He'll never get near her. You don't know Vincent, Marina said, her voice trembling. He has influence, power. If he wants, he can make your adoption process very difficult. At that moment, Ethan's cell phone rang again. It was Rose. Mr. Voronin. Her voice was worried. Leah has a high fever. I think we need to take her to the hospital. The world seemed to spin around him. Leah sick, Vincent returning, Marina reappearing. It was too much to process. I need to go, he said abruptly, already heading for the door. Wait, Marina called, standing up too. Let me see her, please, just once. Ethan stopped, turning slowly. You had 5 years to be her mother. You chose to abandon her. Now it's too late. You don't understand, Marina sobbed. I never stopped loving her. Every day away from her has been torture. No, Ethan replied, his voice filled with a cold anger. You don't understand. While you were hiding, your daughter grew up thinking she wasn't worthy of love, that she was abandoned because she wasn't good enough. That kind of pain doesn't heal with belated apologies. He left the coffee shop with Michael on his heels, his heart pounding erratically in his chest. The rain had returned in full force, but he barely felt the water soaking his clothes. What are we going to do? Michael asked as they ran to the yard's car. First, take care of Leah, Ethan replied, starting the engine. Then we're going to fight with all our strength. As he drove back home, he couldn't stop thinking about Leah, about her strength, her resilience, her ability to love even after everything she had been through. No matter what it cost, he would protect her. From Vincent, from Marina, from anyone who tried to hurt her again. But an insistent voice in his mind asked, how do you protect someone from their own parents? The hospital hallway seemed even colder and more sterile that night. Ethan paced back and forth, his clothes still, damp from the rain, while the doctors examined Leah. The fever had risen alarmingly during the trip to the hospital, and she alternated between moments of confused consciousness and feverish delirium. Dad, she had called in the car, her glazed eyes fixed on something only she could see. Dad, don't drink that medicine, please. Rose was sitting in one of the chairs in the waiting room, her hands occupied with a rosary, praying silently. Michael had stayed behind at the coffee shop, saying he needed to make some urgent calls. Mr. Voronin, a young doctor called, coming out of the room where Leah was being treated. Can we talk? He followed her to a small consulting room, his heart hammering in his chest. The fever is the result of a severe lung infection, the doctor explained, showing some x-rays. Probably a consequence of years living in unsanitary conditions, aggravated by the emotional stress of recent days. But is she going to be okay? Ethan asked, his voice trembling. We started potent antibiotics, but... The doctor hesitated. There are other issues that concern us. Blood tests showed signs of chronic malnutrition, and we found evidence of old fractures that were not treated properly. I know, he replied, running his hands over his tired face. We're working on it. She has appointments scheduled with several specialists. Mr. Voronin, the doctor said softly, you know we need to notify Child Protective Services about these findings, don't you? Before he could respond, they heard screams coming from Leah's room. They ran back and found the girl, struggling in bed, trying to tear off the IV line. No, I don't want to! Dad, stop! She screamed, clearly trapped in some traumatic memory. Liar, it's me! Ethan tried to reach her, but she cowered, protecting her face with her arms. I promise I'll be good, she sobbed. Don't tell him, please! Don't let him hurt me again. The doctor quickly administered a sedative, and gradually Leah calmed down, until she fell into a restless sleep. Him? The doctor asked, making notes on her chart. She's referring to the father. Ethan felt bile rise in his throat. Not just him, he replied, remembering Marina's revelation about Vincent. At that moment, his cell phone vibrated. It was Michael. "Ethan, we have a problem." His friend's voice was tense. "Vincent Rodriguez has moved up his return. He arrives tomorrow." The world seemed to spin around him. How did he find out? "Marina," Michael replied with a heavy sigh. "She called him as soon as we left the coffee shop. Apparently, she's trying to negotiate some kind of deal." "Deal?" Ethan repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. "She wants money," Michael explained, "in exchange for keeping the secret about Leah's paternity. But Vincent, he's not interested in deals now. He wants the girl." Ethan looked at Leah through the window of the room, so small and fragile in the hospital bed, her face marked by fever and suffering. "He's not going to get near her," he said with fierce determination. "It's not going to be that simple," Michael warned. "He's already activated his lawyers. He's claiming paternal rights." The sound of footsteps in the hallway made Ethan turn around. His blood ran cold as he saw Ms. Davis and Sarah, the CPS caseworkers, approaching with serious expressions. "We were notified about the hospitalization," Ms. Davis said without preamble, "and about the new developments." "How?" Ethan began, but Sarah interrupted him. "Marina Santos was at our office this afternoon," she explained. "Before looking for you, she filed a formal request to reconnect with the minor." Ethan's world seemed to crumble. In just a few hours, all the progress he had made with Leah, all the trust they had built, was threatened. "She abandoned her own daughter," he said through gritted teeth, "left Leah with a violent and sick man." "According to her, she was coerced," Ms. Davis replied, consulting some notes. "And now that the threat no longer exists..." "The threat no longer exists?" Ethan almost laughed, a bitter and humorless sound. "Vincent Rodriguez is returning to the US tomorrow. The man who orchestrated the accident that destroyed Roberto's life, who threatened a child, his own daughter, wants to take custody of her. How is that not a threat?" The caseworkers exchanged worried glances. "These are very serious accusations," Sarah said cautiously. "Do you have proof?" Before he could answer, a monitor began to beep in Leah's room. The doctor ran inside, followed by two nurses. "Her pressure is dropping," he heard one of them say. "The fever is back up." Ethan tried to enter, but was blocked by one of the nurses. "Please wait out here." The next few minutes were torture. Through the window, he saw the medical team working frantically around Leah, who seemed even smaller and more fragile under all those machines. His cell phone rang, unknown number. With trembling hands, he answered. "Mr. Voronin," a male voice, deep and controlled, spoke from the other end. "This is Vincent Rodriguez." Ethan felt his entire body freeze. "I heard my daughter is in the hospital," Vincent continued, his tone falsely concerned. "What a pity. Maybe, if she were with someone more capable of taking care of her, this wouldn't have happened." "You monster," Ethan growled. "How dare you?" "Careful with your words." Vincent interrupted him smoothly. "Remember that tomorrow I will be there in person to meet my daughter, and believe me, I have more than enough resources to ensure that she comes with me." The call was terminated, leaving Ethan trembling with anger and fear. When he turned around, he realized that the caseworkers had heard part of the conversation. "Was that him?" Miss Davis asked, her expression softer now. "Vincent Rodriguez?" Ethan nodded, unable to speak. At that moment, the doctor came out of the room. "We managed to stabilize her," she informed. "But she is very weak. Her immune system is compromised by chronic malnutrition." "Can I see her?" Ethan asked, his voice choked. The doctor nodded. "She was calling for you in her lucid moments." When he entered the room, Leah was awake, although clearly exhausted. Her big eyes met his immediately. "Uncle Ethan," she called in a weak voice. Don't let them take me." His heart broke. Even in the midst of fever and pain, she was still worried about that. "No one is going to take you," he promised, holding her small warm hand in his. "Never." "I heard them talking," she continued, tears streaming down her feverish face, "about my mom and about my other dad." Ethan felt like he had been punched in the stomach. How had she found out? "When the fever is very high," Leah explained, as if reading his thoughts. "I remember things that happened a long time ago, about the man with the ring. He hurt my mom, made her cry." "Liar," Ethan began, but she continued, her voice getting weaker and weaker. "I don't want to go with him," she whispered. "Please don't. Let him take me. I want to stay with you. You promised." "And I'm going to keep that promise," Ethan replied, fighting back his own tears. "No matter what happens." Leah closed her eyes, exhaustion finally winning. "Tell me a story," she asked sleepily. "One with a happy ending." Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat and began, "Once upon a time there was a very brave princess, who, even though she had gone through many difficulties, never lost her kindness." As he told the story, he watched Leah's face relax little by little until she finally fell asleep. But her sleep was not peaceful. Occasionally she stirred and mumbled frightened words. Outside the room, he could see the caseworkers talking, in low voices, with the doctor. In a few hours, Vincent Rodriguez would be there, ready to use all his power and influence to take Leah from him. How to protect a child from a man who had enough money to buy justice itself. How to fight someone who didn't hesitate to hurt his own daughter to protect his reputation. His cell phone vibrated again. It was Michael. "I got something. Something big. Hang in there." Ethan looked at Leah, sleeping, and made a silent promise. No matter what happened, no matter how much it cost, he would protect her, even if it meant facing one of the most powerful men in New York. The night would be long, and the battle that was approaching would be the most difficult of his life. But for the first time since he had learned the truth about Vincent, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope, because now he had something to fight for, something more important than any fortune or power. He had love. Morning arrived gray and cold at the hospital. Ethan hadn't slept, remaining by Leah's side all night, watching her fight against the fever. The doctors came in and out of the room constantly, adjusting medications and checking her vital signs, which were finally beginning to stabilize. Rose had gone home to get clean clothes and some belongings, including Leah's favorite teddy bear. When she returned, she also brought disturbing news. There were reporters gathering at the entrance of the hospital. "Someone leaked the story to the press," she explained in a low voice. "They're talking about Vincent Rodriguez and his secret daughter." Ethan felt his stomach churn. Of course, Vincent would use the media to his advantage, creating a narrative of a repentant father wanting to meet his daughter before he died was perfect for manipulating public opinion. Michael arrived shortly after, carrying a thick folder. Under his arm, his face showed signs that he had also spent the night awake. "We need to talk," he said, pulling Ethan to a more private corner of the hallway. Before he could explain, however, they were interrupted by a commotion coming from the reception area. Vincent Rodriguez had arrived, and with him a small army of lawyers and advisors. Even sick, Vincent exuded power. Tall, dressed impeccably in an Italian suit, his perfectly aligned gray hair contrasted with the sickly paleness of his face. And on his right hand, the famous ring glittered under the fluorescent lights of the hospital. "Mr. Voronin," he called, in a smooth voice that didn't match the hardness of his eyes. "Finally, we meet in person." Ethan stepped forward, placing himself between Vincent and the door to Leah's room. "You're not coming in." Vincent smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm afraid that's not your decision. I have here a court order guaranteeing my right to see my daughter." One of the lawyers extended a document, which Michael quickly intercepted. "This order hasn't been officially validated yet," he argued, flipping through the papers. "And considering the current health status of the minor—" "Health status that is directly related to Mr. Voronin's inadequate care," another lawyer interjected, "or lack thereof." "How dare you?" Ethan stepped forward, but Michael held him back. "That's exactly what they want," he whispered, "to provoke you to look unstable." At that moment, a sharp cry came from the room. Leah had woken up. "Uncle Ethan," she called, her voice filled with fear. "Where are you?" Vincent took a step towards the door, but Ethan blocked his passage. "She's scared," he said through gritted teeth. "You're just gonna make things worse." "She's my daughter," Vincent replied, his mask of cordiality beginning to crack. "My blood." "Blood?" Ethan almost laughed. "Since when do you care about blood? You were the one who orchestrated the accident that destroyed her life." A heavy silence fell over the hallway. The lawyers exchanged nervous glances, and for a moment, something like fear crossed Vincent's eyes. "Careful with your accusations, Mr. Voronin," he said softly. "They may be considered defamation." "They're not accusations," Michael interjected, opening his folder. "They're facts, documented and proven." He began to spread papers on a nearby table. Internal reports from the construction company, old emails, receipts for suspicious payments. "I spent all night organizing this," he continued. "There's enough evidence here not only to prove the sabotage of the equipment that caused Roberto's accident, but also the bribery of inspectors, the buying of witnesses, and the threats against Marina and Leah." Vincent remained impassive, but his face had lost even more color. "Interesting theory," he said coldly, "but they're old documents, easily contestable. My word against that of a woman who abandoned her own daughter." "It's not just her word," a new voice entered the conversation. Everyone turned to see Marina standing in the hallway, pale but determined. Beside her was an elderly man whom Ethan recognized from the old photos, the former chief engineer of the construction company. "Carlos," Vincent murmured, genuinely surprised. "What are you doing here?" "Doing what I should have done years ago," the engineer replied, his voice tired but firm. "Telling the truth." Marina stepped forward, avoiding looking at the room where her daughter was. "I didn't come here to cause more problems," she said softly. "I came because I can't let this continue. I can't let you hurt her again." "I never hurt her," Vincent growled, but Marina shook her head. "You hurt her the moment you decided that your reputation was more important than her life. When you ordered to sabotage that equipment, knowing that Roberto could die. When you forced me to abandon her with threats." Her voice failed for a moment, tears streaming silently. "But the worst thing," she continued, "was letting her grow up thinking she wasn't worthy of love, that her own mother had abandoned her because she wasn't good enough." "Uncle Ethan," Leah's voice called again from the room, weaker now. People fighting?" Ethan felt his heart clench. Even sick, she was still trying to protect others. "Everything's okay, honey," he replied, keeping his voice calm. "Rest, I'll be right in." Vincent took another step towards the door, but this time it was Carlos who stopped him. "Enough, Vincent," he said firmly. "I kept your secrets for years because you threatened me, threatened my family. But now you're dying. What can you do to me or anyone?" The lawyers began to stir, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Vincent silenced them with a gesture. "What do you want?" he asked Carlos, his voice dangerously low. "I want to tell everything," the engineer replied, "about how you personally ordered the replacement of safety cables with cheaper ones, how you ignored my warnings about the risk, how later, when Roberto survived and threatened to sue, you planned every detail to destroy his life." Vincent laughed, a cold and humorless sound. And who's going to believe you? A resentful old man with stories from the past? I have proof, Carlos replied calmly. I kept everything. Every memo, every order, every threat. For years I carried this guilt, knowing that my silence had destroyed a family. I'm not going to be silent anymore. The hallway became absolutely silent. The lawyers looked nervously between Vincent and Carlos, clearly reassessing their positions. It was then that a different sound cut through the air, small and hesitant steps. Everyone turned to see Leah standing in the doorway of the room, supported by Rose, her little face still marked by fever but her eyes extraordinarily lucid. I remember you, she said, looking directly at Vincent. Your ring, the noise it made when you hit the table and yelled at my mom. Vincent seemed to wither visibly under the girl's gaze. All his power, all his arrogance seemed insignificant in the face of the simple and cruel truth in a child's eyes. Liar. Marina took a step towards her, but the girl cowered. No, she said firmly, despite her weak voice. I don't want any of you. I want Uncle Ethan. Honey, you need to go back to bed. Rose tried to intervene, but Leah continued, her small hands trembling, but her voice firm. You're bad, she declared, looking from Vincent to Marina. You hurt my dad, my real dad. It doesn't matter. If he wasn't my blood father, he stayed with me even when he was in pain, even when he drank that bad medicine that made him different. Tears began to stream down her face, but she continued. And now you want to take me away from Uncle Ethan. He's the only person who has never lied to me, who has never hurt me, who keeps his promises. Her legs faltered, and Ethan quickly picked her up in his arms before she fell. Please, she whispered, hiding her face in his neck, don't let them take me. The hallway became absolutely silent, broken only by the soft sound of Leah's crying. Vincent stared at the scene with an expression impossible to decipher, a mixture of shock, shame, and something that might have been regret. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he turned to his lawyers. Let's go, he ordered, his voice hoarse. Cancel everything. But, sir, one of them began to protest. The court order. Cancel it, Vincent repeated more firmly. Then, surprising everyone, he took the ring off his finger and placed it on the table along with Michael's documents. That's the only thing she remembers about me, he said softly, more to himself than to the others. The ring that scared her. Without looking back, he began to walk towards the exit. His lawyers followed him, clearly confused by the sudden change. Marina remained where she was, silent tears streaming down her face as she watched Leah in Ethan's arms. She's happy with you, she said finally. Safe, loved, it's all I ever wanted for her. Then leave her in peace, Ethan replied, not with anger, but with firmness. Let her heal her wounds without opening new ones. Marina nodded slowly. When she's ready. If one day she wants to know the whole truth. Look for me. Ethan didn't respond, just adjusted Leah better in his arms and took her back to the room. The girl was already almost asleep, exhausted by the effort and the fever. Stay with me? She asked sleepily. Always, he promised, sitting in the chair next to the bed without letting go of her. As Leah finally fell asleep in his arms, Ethan looked out the hospital window. The sun was beginning to appear timidly between the clouds, as if the sky itself recognized that a new phase was beginning. The battle wasn't completely over. There were still documents to sign, lawsuits to resolve, wounds to heal. But for the first time since he had found Leah on that bridge, Ethan felt that they were truly safe, because now they weren't just two broken people trying to survive. They were a family, built not with blood or documents, but with something much stronger, unconditional love, and the promise to never separate again. The days that followed in the hospital were a roller coaster of emotions. Leah's fever finally subsided, but her recovery would be slow. The doctors explained that years of malnutrition and precarious conditions had left her immune system weakened. Every small progress was a hard-won victory. Ethan practically moved into the hospital, turning the small room into a kind of improvised camp. Rose came every day with homemade food and clean clothes, trying to bring some normality to that sterile environment. "Uncle Ethan?" Leah called on a particularly quiet afternoon, her voice still weak but firmer than in previous days. "Can I ask you something?" He looked up from the laptop where he was working remotely. The company needed to keep running, even with his absence. "Of course, honey. What is it? Why didn't you give up on me? Even when Vincent said he was my real dad?" The question took Ethan by surprise. Leah was sitting on the bed, hugging the teddy bear, looking even smaller amidst the medical equipment. "Because you didn't give up on me either," he replied honestly. "That night on the bridge, when everyone else had given up, you were the only one who tried to save me." Leah was silent for a moment, processing his words. "But I didn't save you," she said finally. "You jumped anyway." "No," Ethan smiled softly. "You did save me. Not that night, but every day since then. You gave me a reason to live again." Leah's eyes filled with tears. Even though I'm not your real daughter?" "Hey, come here," he called her, sitting on the edge of the bed and pulling her into a careful hug, mindful of the tubes and monitors. "Family isn't just about blood. It's about love, about choice. And I choose you every day." "I choose you, too," she murmured against his chest. "But I'm scared." "Scared of what, little one?" "Scared that one day you won't want me anymore. That you'll think I'm too much trouble, like my dad used to say." Ethan felt his heart clench. Even after everything they had been through, the traumas of the past still haunted Leah. "You know," he began softly, "I was also very scared after I'd lost Lily and Ava, scared to love again, to care about someone, because it hurt too much when I lost them." Leah raised her face to look at him, her big eyes attentive to every word. "But then you appeared," he continued, "and showed me that there was still room in my heart for more love, that we can be scared and still be brave. Like the princess in the story you told me," she asked, referring to the tale he had invented during their first night in the hospital. "Exactly. And you know what the best part is? Our story is still being written, and I promise I'll be here for every chapter of it." At that moment, they were interrupted by a gentle knock on the door. It was Ms. Davis, the CPS caseworker, accompanied by a kind-looking lady who introduced herself as Dr. Campbell, the child psychologist appointed by the judge. "We hope we're not interrupting," Ms. Davis said, her tone very different from the professional coldness of their first meetings. "But we need to discuss the next steps." Leah immediately tensed in Ethan's arms, but Dr. Campbell smiled reassuringly. "Don't worry, honey," she said in a soft voice. "No one is going to separate you from Ethan." The hesitation in the form of a dress did not go unnoticed. It was one of the issues that needed to be resolved. What should Leah call him? What would be their official relationship? "Actually," Ms. Davis continued, "we're here with good news. Vincent Rodriguez officially withdrew any claim to paternal rights. And Marina Santos, well, she signed a document relinquishing custody permanently." Ethan felt Leah tremble slightly in his arms. "That means," he began, but Ms. Davis interrupted him with a small smile. "It means we can start the official adoption process, if that's what you want, of course." The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan looked at Leah, who was staring at him with a mixture of hope and fear. "Is that what you want?" he asked softly. "Do you want me to be your dad, officially?" For a moment, Leah didn't answer. Her eyes filled with tears again. But this Time, there was something different in them, not sadness or fear, but a deeper, more complex emotion. Can I call you Dad?" she asked in a whisper so low that it was barely audible. It was Ethan's turn to feel tears in his eyes. "You can call me whatever you want, whatever you feel in your heart." Leah hid her face in his chest again, sobbing softly. "Then I want you to be my dad, my real dad." Dr. Campbell discreetly wiped away a tear while Ms. Davis smiled openly. "Well," the caseworker said, "I think that answers our question. I'll prepare the necessary documentation." But before she could continue, they were surprised by another unexpected visit. Rose entered the room carrying a large and colorful box. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but this arrived at the apartment. It's for Leah." Inside the box were several children's books, all new, with a simple note: "To help you write your own stories. With love, Marina." Leah looked at the books with a complex expression, a mixture of curiosity, hurt, and something that might have been forgiveness. "Want me to put them away?" Rose asked gently. "You don't have to decide now what to do with them." "No," Leah replied after a moment. "I want to keep them, but I want Dad to read them to me." The word Dad came naturally from her lips, as if it had always belonged there. Ethan felt his heart expand in a way he didn't think possible since losing Lily. "How about we start now?" he suggested, picking up one of the books. "Ladies, if you'll excuse us." Ms. Davis and Dr. Campbell said goodbye, promising to return the next day to officially begin the adoption process. Rose stayed a little longer, tidying up the room and preparing a snack for later. When they were finally alone, Ethan opened the first book. It was a story about a girl who discovered that family wasn't just about blood, but about love and choices. "Once upon a time," he began to read, but Leah interrupted him. "Dad," she called, testing the word again. "Do you think Lily would have liked me? To have a sister?" The question hit Ethan like a punch to the stomach, but not in a painful way. It was more like something inside him finally clicked into place. "Lily would have loved you very much," he replied, his voice choked. "Just like I love you both." Leah smiled, a true smile which illuminated her still pale little face. "Then continue the story," she asked, snuggling closer to him. "I want to know if it has a happy ending." "All stories can have a happy ending," he replied, kissing her forehead. "It depends on how we choose to tell them." And so, as the afternoon fell outside, father and daughter, now truly united not by blood but by choice and love, began to write their own chapter of happiness. The recovery would still be long. There were traumas to be healed, fears to be faced, trust to be rebuilt. But now they had something that neither of them had before, the certainty that they wouldn't have to face anything alone. Because sometimes the strongest families are not the ones we are born into, but the ones we choose. And Ethan and Leah had chosen each other, saving one another in the process. It was a new beginning, a new story. And this time they would ensure that it had a happy ending. 6 months had passed since the events at the hospital. Spring was arriving in New York City, bringing with it a warm breeze that made the curtains of Leah's room dance gently. The room, formerly a cold and impersonal office, now overflowed with life and color. Drawings covered the walls, books filled the shelves, and carefully organized toys occupied every available corner. Ethan watched from the door as Leah got ready for her first day of school. After months of intensive therapy and careful preparation, she was finally ready to attend school. Her little body, once so fragile and malnourished, had strengthened. Her cheeks were rosy, her eyes sparkled with a joy that had once seemed impossible. "How do I look?" she asked, twirling to show off her new uniform. Her hair, now always well-groomed, was tied in 2 braids that Rose had made with care. "Beautiful," Ethan replied, feeling his heart swell with love and pride. Ready to meet your new friends? Leah hesitated for a moment, biting her lower lip, a habit that appeared whenever. She was nervous. What if they don't like me? She asked softly. What if they ask about my other family? Ethan knelt down to be at her level, adjusting the ribbon of one of the braids affectionately. Remember what Dr. Campbell said? You only tell what you want when you want. Your story belongs to you. She nodded but still seemed worried. Dad, can I ask you something? The term dad still made Ethan's heart leap. After 3 months of the adoption process, it was finally official. Leah was his daughter not only in his heart, but also in the documents. Of course, Princess. What is it? Can we stop by that place before school, just for a minute? Ethan knew exactly what place she was referring to. It was a ritual they had established in recent months, visiting Roberto's grave before each important moment in Leah's life. Of course we can, he replied softly. I'll get the flowers that Rose set aside. The cemetery was quiet at that time of the morning. Leah walked with sure steps to the place she already knew so well, carrying a small bouquet of daisies, her adoptive father's favorite flowers. Hi, Dad Roberto, she said, when they arrived at the simple but well-kept grave. They came to tell you that today is my first day of school, really, in a real school. Ethan stood a few steps behind, giving her privacy to talk to Roberto. It was a scene that always moved him, seeing how Leah managed to keep love in her heart for Roberto even after everything she had been through. Dad Ethan bought me a beautiful backpack with unicorns, she continued, and Rose made braids just the way you liked. Remember, you always said I looked like a princess with braids. Her voice faltered a little, but she continued, I wish you could see how happy I am now. I don't have to be afraid anymore or go hungry, and that medicine that made you get different, well, you don't need it anymore, right? Now you're resting. Ethan felt silent tears stream down his face. Leah had lost so much, suffered so much, but still maintained an incredible ability to forgive and love. Oh, and there's one more thing, she added, her voice lower now. Remember, Mom? She sent me more books last week. Dad Ethan said that when I'm ready, I can meet her, but only if I want to, when I want to. Marina had kept her word, keeping her distance but occasionally sending small gifts, always books, always through Rose, always without pressure or demands. I think one day I'll want to, Leah continued. Not now, but one day. Because you always said that keeping anger in your heart only hurts us, and I don't want to be hurt anymore. Ethan took another step back, wiping away his tears discreetly. How could a child of only 6 years have so much wisdom? I need to go now, Leah said, arranging the flowers in the vase. I promise I'll come tell you everything later. I love you, Dad Roberto. When she turned around, her eyes were also watery, but there was a serene smile on her face. Can we go, Dad? She called, extending her hand to Ethan. On the way to school, Leah was unusually quiet, looking out the car window with a thoughtful expression. A penny for your thoughts, Ethan joked, trying to relieve the tension. I was thinking about when I saw you for the first time, she replied surprisingly. On the bridge. Ethan felt his heart clench. That night seemed to have happened in another life. You seem so sad, she continued, just like I used to be when Dad Roberto drank that bad medicine. And I thought, if he jumps, he'll never know that it can get better. And you were right, Ethan replied, his voice choked. It got better. Much better. Leah smiled, that smile that lit up her whole face. It got better for me too. You know. Why? Why? Because now I have 3 dads, she said simply. Dad Roberto, who even sick and sad never abandoned me. Dad Vincent, who even though he was bad at first, in the end understood that love is more important than pride. And you, Dad Ethan, who chose me even when you didn't have to. Ethan had to pull the car over for a moment, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. How could she say things like that, which went straight to his heart? "And Mom?" he asked softly. "What do you think about her?" Leah was silent for a moment, playing with the strap of her new backpack. "I think she was also very scared," she replied finally. "Just like you were afraid to love again after Lily. But you know what I learned from you, Dad?" "What, little one?" "That we can be scared and still do the right thing. That love is stronger than fear." When they arrived at the school, the yard was full of children and parents saying goodbye. Leah held Ethan's hand tighter. "Everything's going to be all right," he assured. "I'll be here waiting when you're done. Promise?" "I promise, and you know I always keep my promises." She smiled, adjusting the backpack on her shoulders. Before entering, however, she turned to him one last time. "Dad, thank you for not giving up on me, on you, on us." Ethan knelt down, hugging her tightly. "I'll never give up, my daughter. Never." As he watched Leah enter the school, head held high and steps firm, Ethan thought about how life could change completely in an instant. A year ago, he was ready to give up everything. Today, he had a reason to smile every morning. His phone vibrated. It was a message from Michael. "How was the grand premiere?" Ethan took a picture of Leah entering the school and sent it to his friend, along with the reply, "Perfect, like everything has been since she came into my life." Later that day, after picking up Leah from school and hearing all her animated stories about her first day, after the special dinner that Rose had prepared to celebrate, after reading 3 bedtime stories, because it was a special day and deserved more stories, Ethan sat in the armchair in Leah's room watching her sleep. On the wall opposite the bed, a mural full of photos told their story. Leah in the hospital, already smiling despite the tubes and monitors. Leah on her first day at home, still shy and scared. Leah on the day of the official adoption, proudly holding the papers. Leah playing in the park, swimming in the pool, baking cakes with Rose, living all the experiences that a child deserves to have. And on a special shelf, carefully kept, were Marina's gifts. Each book a bridge to a future where perhaps, when Leah was ready, mother and daughter could build a new story together. Beside the bed, on a small table, there were 3 picture frames, one with an old photo of Roberto holding baby Leah, another with a recent photo of her with Ethan, and in the middle, a photo of Lily. Because Leah had insisted that her sister from heaven, as she called her, also needed a special place. In the room. "Dad?" Leah called sleepily, half opening her eyes. "Hey, princess. Need anything?" "Just wanted to make sure you were here," she murmured, already falling back to sleep. "Love you?" "Love you too, my daughter," Ethan replied, his heart overflowing. "With love, forever." As the night fell over New York City, Ethan thought about how unpredictable life was. About how sometimes we need to lose everything to find something even more precious. About how love can be born in the most unlikely places, in the most difficult circumstances. He thought of Lily and Ava, who would always live in his heart. Of Roberto, who despite his demons had loved Leah in the way he could. Of Marina, who was slowly learning that regret can also be a path to redemption. Of Vincent, who in the end chose to do the right thing, even if it was too late to fix all the harm he had caused. But mostly, he thought of Leah, of how a little girl had the courage to reach out to a stranger on a bridge, offering hope when everything seemed lost. Of how she taught him that family isn't just blood, but a daily choice to love and protect. It was an unlikely story, born of pain but transformed by love. A story of second chances, of new beginnings, of broken hearts that found healing in each other. A story with a happy ending. Not because everything was perfect. There were still hard days. There were still fears and uncertainties. But because now they faced it all together as a family. A family built not by obligation or circumstance, but by choice, by love, And in the end, that was all that mattered.